On the face of it, the answer to my question is obvious. It's right there in the Nicene Creed. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered death and was buried. On the third day, he rose again in accordance with the Scriptures. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. The Creed comes from the year 325, and it is based on the Gospels. But how well does it reflect reality? Well, the first phrase probably is historical, since there are a couple of references in ancient sources other than the Gospels that mention Jesus' crucifixion. This may well be the only fact of Jesus' life that we have, and it's a nasty one. Roman crucifixion was intended totally to erase a person from existence. Even after death, the body was left to scavengers. It's very unlikely Jesus was ever buried. The rest of the creedal statement, as well as the Gospels, come from outside history. Think for a moment about the reality of crucifixion. Then realize that Jesus had been a traveling teacher and storyteller who modeled a peaceful lifestyle. As word of his death got around to the various communities he had visited, people who had known him must have been shocked into a deep grief. In their grief, some may well have had visions of Jesus alive and guiding them in the path of peace. Paul reports in 1 Corinthians that various persons had visions of Jesus. Visions, not physical sightings. Paul always uses figurative, not literal language when talking about the resurrection. When, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul describes the resurrected Jesus, he envisions a totally new human form, not the sort of pincushion Jesus you find in Luke and John. This envisioning was not the reaction Roman authorities expected when they crucified Jesus. They expected to scare people into abandoning Jesus and his teachings. The impact of Jesus on those who had experienced him proved more powerful than even the fear of death by Roman authorities. When it comes to the story that served as the foundation for the creeds, it appears Mark composed it. Then Matthew, John, and Luke expanded that basic narrative. So let's take a look at what Mark did. First and foremost in his mind, as Mark composed his gospel, was the destruction of Jerusalem, during which hundreds of people, perhaps even thousands, most of them innocent civilians, were crucified. This brought to his mind what one scholar calls the story of the persecuted and vindicated innocent one. This saga developed over centuries. It drew on the story of Joseph and his brothers, then blossomed in the prophetic tradition and the Apocrypha. It shows people in the Hebraic tradition struggling with the question, why does God let sinful Gentiles lord it over God's chosen people? When it comes to composing, Mark used a style known as midrash. Midrash takes a collection of otherwise unrelated scripture passages and uses them to frame a unique narrative. So the Passion story in Mark is a piece of creative writing designed to help the people in his community both to cope with the fall of Jerusalem and to see in the suffering and death of Jesus a reflection of their own perilous situation. Mark is also responsible for the burial of Jesus. Then, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, people most often claim Mark leaves us with an empty tomb. I think that's not quite the case. When the women come to the tomb early in the morning on the first day of the week, they don't find it empty. They find instead a young man with a message that so disturbs them that they run away and say nothing to anyone. We should pay attention to the young man's message. Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Mark's gospel loops around on itself. The end directs us back to the beginning, where Jesus comes from Nazareth of Galilee and is baptized by John in the Jordan. Mark was wise, I think, to end his story this way, because resurrection is an inevitable concept. Trying to make it concrete is just plain silly. That, however, didn't stop later writers from trying. Once we realize how and why Mark created the Passion story, we are free to recapture the human called Jesus of Nazareth. Without making him divine, we can appreciate the value of a human life lived in support of others, which ended in tragedy. Yet the tragedy did not overwhelm the positive values of his ways. Those values are the eternal legacy of Jesus.